So we will get started on our design thinking webinar, and a very warm welcome, Dr. Melis Senova. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
and
you.
I, along with our attendees, are very excited and looking forward to what you have to say about and take us on this journey that you have been on. So to introduce Melis, Melis is an author, she's an entrepreneur. These days, she's also doing work in leadership, which I think would be great for you to share that with us at the end of the session as well, Melis.
Sure.
And I thought it would be great if you could perhaps do a little introduction on yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be this global expert on design thinking. So over to you, Melis.
I always thank you, Grania. Thank you for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I can hear some doggies in the background.
Are
they your doggies? Yeah. We were just talking about this, weren't we? Yeah, I always cringe at the notion of an expert because of the nature of my field being design, which is that, you know, you're often working with experts in order to achieve an outcome. And my journey into human-centered design and design thinking is a little bit unorthodox as well. So my background is actually in biomedical sciences, and I was majoring in neuroscience, and always interested in the human, in the system, always interested in what was going on for the person and how does the person work and how are we making sense of the world, and very much coming at it from a sort of science lens. So I worked in research hospitals and I studied the brain and I imaged the brain and did all of these things until I realized that I was more interested in how do we, with this understanding of how people exist in the world, how do we use that understanding to better improve the realities of people? And I found out that was actually that's a design question. And so that's when I did my PhD in human-centered design. And at that time, I was really interested in high-performing teams, flow states. And so I did my PhD with the Defense Department with fighter pilots, looking at optimizing their performance. So I wanted to look at the human in the system that was already pushed to the limits. So, you know, technology to the limits and also human performance to the limits. And then that took me to doing human-centered design in all sorts of environments. So I've really cut my teeth in design, so product development design at Ford and Sumitomo, where we were working on, electronic modules that made the car work. And I was looking at everything that interfaced with the driver and the passenger. So all the buttons and the displays and all of that sort of stuff in the Falcon and the Territory, I was designing those things. And then I moved to telecommunications. So I spent some time in Telstra working with emerging technology and established the Experience Design Group there in the CTO. And then about 11 years ago now, I think, I co-founded Huddle. And Huddle is a specialist strategic design firm. We've been operating since 2009, and now that's me. I'm here.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa. It's a great journey, I've got to say, that you've been on. And of course, we met one another at South by Southwest in 2017 when you were a speaker there, an invited speaker, and you also, of course, launched your book. And one of the things that struck me when you were doing your presentation and you talked about the importance of the end user in product development and so on. And at that stage, Quitch was very, very new, I have to say. We were just getting started. But that day I decided that we had to speak further with you and find out more about this human-centered design around the product. And of course, you and your team worked closely with us at Quitch for quite some time in terms of designing the product, and something we're very pleased about today because we know it has made a significant impact in the importance of the learner, how they use their product, the importance of how we design it, keeping them front of mind. But one of the things that I always remember you talking about when you're designing product, you talked about that human connection and that genuine human connection that you need to make, you talked about, and the impact of that. Could I ask you to talk a little bit about that today?
Yeah, of course. So, human-centered design has actually been around for quite a long time. So I would say it started getting popular when personal computers started getting popular. So it sort of started in the human computer interaction space, sort of in the 70s and then into the 80s. And one of the things that, so in the time that I've been practicing human-centered design, so let's just call that since 2000, since I finished my PhD, one of the transitions that has happened is that people have gone from assuming that they know what their customers need to actually going out there and asking them. And so when I talk about a real human connection, I'm talking about it on lots of different levels. So so I won't call it the superficial, but the primary level that I'm talking about is to be really mindful of the organizational perspective that you may have of your customer. So you may be in a customer experience team and you may be tasked with designing for the customer and advocating for the customer. But there are still many organizations that hesitate to actually do research with their customers, actually with them, and observing the way that they actually interact with their product and many workarounds that people come up with. If something doesn't make logical sense to them or they find the menu structure a little bit difficult, there'll be workarounds that they create that you can never really know about unless you observe someone doing something very creative with something that you've designed, which I've experienced. So there's that level of human connection, which is actually very functional. It's a very task-oriented human connection. And then there's another one, which is a little bit deeper, and that's more about why people do what they do. So it's not what it is that they're doing or how they're going about doing it, but why? Why are they bothering in the first place? And why are they choosing it to do it then and in this context and in this way? And that's where design research becomes really important. So that's looking into the motivations of people, understanding why they do what they do. So that's the next level.
I really like that, Melis, as you were talking there about, and I've seen this so often, I can talk about the education sector, and hopefully when in the audience, we might have some people from the education sector as well as the corporate sector. And I would absolutely ask that question, how often in designing solutions, I can talk about universities and so on, I've seen so many solutions put forward or technologies implemented without any student voice amongst them. I've seen the same thing in corporates, and we worked more recently with a number of corporates, and it's actually great to see that they are actually very interested now in that co-design and getting the employee voice around that solution as well. And I see that as something, though, that's fairly new, certainly in the world of education. And hopefully some of our audience can join this conversation and put something in the chat function for us there. But I think that does seem to me something fairly new. Do you agree, or have you seen this coming on for some time?
Well, I think because of the field, this is my field. So I've seen all sorts of organizations. I've worked with organizations that are really quite mature in their understanding of human-centered design and design thinking. And then absolutely other organizations that are just beginning to understand the value that this type of thinking and doing can provide them. But it's really it's a difficult philosophy or mindset to be able to adopt kind of at the turn of a hat, especially in industries like education and perhaps the justice industry. So I wouldn't call that an industry, but a sector that we've been doing some work in. There are some really entrenched mindsets and power dynamics and stuff that are set up that are there for very good reason. So the power dynamic between the educator and the student, or the power dynamic between sort of the magistrate and the people in front of the magistrate. And one of the things about design is that it really shifts that power dynamic. So it basically says, even though in a world, so say in education or higher education in particular, in a world where I am expected to be the expert in a particular domain, which is why I'm in front of you teaching you, what design says is actually you're the person who's learning from the person that you're ultimately in service of, which is the student. And in that they actually have expertise in their experience of learning that you could never have because you're not them. And that whole dynamic is actually quite a difficult one to shift in some places. Of course, there's personality and culture and all of that sort of stuff that comes into the mix. But often, once that understanding and that hurdle is overcome, then it can grow and flourish within an organization. But that's kind of like how you can have high entry barriers, like that. The power dynamics and the norms of an industry is one of those things that needs to be overcome.
I find this really interesting around the power dynamics, because I think that is so true, certainly in the education sector, and indeed in the corporate sector, exactly the same. But in terms of that shift of power, have you seen, or are you able to give some examples maybe of where you've seen some significant impact when that power has shifted to really getting that feedback from the learner?
I mean, something really specific doesn't come immediately to mind, but where I usually see it is when we invite the client to observe some customer research that we're doing. And what typically happens is, as a passive observer, they will get a window into the reality of someone else that they otherwise would not have the opportunity to see. And I would say more than 95% of the time, they have a, oh my gosh moment. They go, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that that's what they were doing, or I couldn't understand. I would never have been able to understand how important that feature was for them, or why don't they push the button? It's right there. It's right there in front of them. Why aren't they pushing it? And it's not until they can see the value of engaging in this way that you get them to actually make that shift. And it's almost like a don't tell me, show me scenario. So if you can get them to the table, which in itself has its own challenges, but if you can get them into a position where they can observe themselves watching a customer struggle with something, or even an employee trying to, navigate an internal system around, pay or whatever, that we're all human beings. And often one of the things that happens in human-centered design actually and customer centricity is that we privilege the customer, like these are the people that are even sort of more evolved on the journey, over all of the other humans that are in the organization. So there's another trick there as well, which is that human-centered design applies to all humans in the system, not just your users and your customers. Because, you've heard me say this 1,000 times, what's inside the organization manifests outside the organization, right? So if you make things really, really difficult to deliver for your staff, then the customer experience of that service delivery is going to be compromised.
Yes. Great insights, Melissa. I always enjoy listening to you. We do now have something in our chat, and I'm going to read it out for you. So I think, this is, I think in education, we have talked about co-creation design to engage employers and students. We've moved a little way with employers, but upon reflection, not so much with the students. Is that a lack of trust in our students' competence to provide input? Is it that in higher education, the student is both the client and the customer? Yeah.
So I think there's lots of things going on there. I think the first point that I made around entrenched roles and entrenched understandings of what it means to be an educator, or what it means to be, a lecturer or a professor or whatever. It's not necessarily a deliberate thing where you're deliberately, diminishing the input of a student. I don't think it's that conscious, actually. It's just that's the role you play. And design really is a leveling. It's a humble methodology where we talk about things like beginner's mind and trying to be okay with attaching to other people's perspectives, even though they could be completely in opposition to your own. The concept of empathy and curiosity and all of these things. Sometimes fly in complete opposition to a role that someone is used to having. So if we were to take a corporate scenario, a chief risk officer is there to make sure that nothing bad happens. So, when we start talking to them about, assume that you've never seen risk before and you're thinking, blue sky and anything's possible, they just sort of look at you like you're crazy and kind of go, that's not my job. Like, that's not what I'm here to do. Yeah. And so there are these really, really difficult mental models that actually need to be slightly sort of acknowledged and understood and then sort of pushed aside just for the time being. And I think that if we can understand that we can never really be an expert in another person's experience, like we can't ever be that, then everyone becomes an expert in their own experience of something. And it is scary, I have to also say, it is scary for people who are providing a service, whether that's education or justice or whatever, or healthcare or whatever it is, to actually open up to the people that are receiving that service and kind of go, so how are we going?
Yeah, exactly. As you were saying that, yes, I thought there's a lot really there about fear, really, isn't there? And there's a lot about trust.
Absolutely. And I think the point that was raised in the question, I think, around the students and not trusting the students, I think that's a really, really important one. Yeah. Because, insight can come from anywhere, and it usually comes from the most unexpected places. And if we don't have a mindset that's open to learning, how ironic is this, open to learning from anyone, anywhere, at any time, then we're limiting ourselves to being able to stumble upon an opportunity that otherwise wouldn't be available to us. And I think that is really fundamental to engaging in this type of work.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And I think, on the journey that I've been on as well, I just think that's so important, that whole idea of that active listening. But you have to trust and you have to overcome that fear. You do not have all the solutions yourself. And it's so important, to hear from people who are going to use that product. And I think especially in the higher education sector, we talk about that as well, is the is getting that student voice in the solutions, or if it's a corporate, getting that employee's voice in the solution. And where we started this conversation, to me, I haven't seen that so often. Obviously, you're in the design world, so you've seen more of it. But I think I think we need to do more and more of it, I must say.
And I think the other thing that I feel like sharing on this point in particular is that engaging with the students about how to improve a service or an experience of a course or whatever the question might be, it doesn't necessarily mean that what they exactly say gets implemented. And I think this is a really, really important point, because we often think that when we go and speak to the customer, we go and speak to the student, and this is going to go back to my first point around connection, not what, but why. They might say, I get bored in 1 hour lectures. I only want 15-minute lectures and I want to snack on content, and that's all I want. It doesn't mean that the very next day we start, cutting all of our lectures to 15 minutes time slots and we give them snackable things. The question actually is, well, why is that? Why are you finding it difficult to concentrate for an hour? Where are you? What are you doing? What else is happening in your life? And it might be that, they're exhausted, or it might be that there's something else going on or whatever. And it might not actually be something that's within your sphere of influence to address. But knowing that may change the delivery of the content. So the point that I'm trying to make is that sometimes we communicate with our customers in a way to understand their voice and then feel obliged to implement exactly what they said. And that's kind of not really the point of human-centered design, actually. It's to understand the motivations and to have that inform the design decisions that you're making about your product.
Yeah, inform the design is exactly right. Yeah, important point there. Melissa, we have another question for you.
Yes.
Do you recommend or use any mental models to help corporate stakeholders understand the approach of HCD? Great question.
It's a great question. I do, and I do it in sort of bite-sized chunks. So I'll give you an example. So I don't have a mental model that would describe human-centered design in its totality, but there's mental models that I use to describe the different elements of human-centered design. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that we talk about in human-centered design is intention and stance. So the stance that you have, the approach that you have to something is really important. And to be able to explain what I mean by that word, stance, is I use the metaphor of sailing to be able to say, we could be jumping on a boat on one day with the intention to race, and we have a destination in mind. And because our intention is to race, everyone's going to turn up on the boat with that understanding that we're going to be racing. And the way that we do our activities are going to be in the context of that racing stance, that racing approach. Everything's going to be quick. We're going to be trimmed. We're going to do all of that stuff. The very next day, we can show up on exactly the same boat with exactly the same people, with exactly the same destination, but we have a stance of cruising. And so the only thing that's changed in that system, which is the people and let's say the organization and the vehicle that we have, is the intention and the stance. So, and so, an intention and a stance for human-centered design is one about, open mindsets and being able to change direction and being able to be risk tolerant and have, curiosity around making mistakes and all of that sort of stuff. That's an example. It's not really a mental model. It's more of a metaphor, but we kind of get at it that way. The other thing that we talk a lot about is, and again, I wouldn't call this a mental model either, but so maybe the answer is no, I don't use mental models. But one of the things that we often talk about is people's experience of uncertainty and ambiguity. And this is coming back into the fear place. We help people understand why they want to make decisions the way that they know how to, which is based on numbers, very nicely planned, with a strategy that goes out for 12 months to 24 months. Because what that does is it gives a little bit of predictability and stability. When you're working in a space where there's not a lot of fluctuation and variability, that works. But when you're working in a space where there is a lot of fluctuation, as we have all experienced, we've got a shared experience of that in the last 2 years, it's very difficult to make a plan and stick to it and execute. And one of the things about design is that it is, this is very meta, it's designed, its intention is to actually work in that way. So it's really well suited to high ambiguity and high complex scenarios. So we try and get people to understand the nature of human-centered design by talking about concepts like ambiguity and uncertainty and complexity, because they're more familiar in an organizational context than perhaps divergent thinking and creativity and ideation and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting in terms of, let's face it, we've never been in more uncertain times. And it's so what you're saying there, Melissa, is that in these uncertain times and with this ambiguity, that design background that you have is actually something that is very helpful. So that's something we could look at in the higher education sector and the corporate sector as something to support us as we go forward here and really try and refine, if you like, our way.
Yeah. And I think, and one of the reasons why design is really well suited to that is that the methodology itself is inherently emergent. And what that means is as you take action, as you learn more, it informs your next action. And when you, so in the definition of a complex system is one that is dynamic. So every day it kind of changes. A complicated system is something like, working out how to get a person on the moon. It's very complicated, but it's governed by laws that we understand, and we can use maths to be able to predict pretty well how that's going to go. A complex system are usually socio-technical systems that involve humans, because humans are the variable things. And I use parenting as a beautiful example of a complex system. You can have exactly the same conversation at exactly the same time with the exact two people, and it just goes really well one day and it doesn't go so well the other day. And with complex systems, we can't think through the answers. We don't have the capacity as humans to think through every possible combination and permutation of a complex system. And what we do is we have to act through. We have to act through complexity. And what design does is it provides a framework to be able to guide that action in the safest possible way. And it does that through iteration. It does that through deep insight. It does that through understanding the nature of discovery, and that not everything is going to be perfect the first time, and all of that. And that's why it's actually, I think of it as a risk mitigation strategy, actually, in complexity, as opposed to something that feels sort of innovative and fresh and new and risky. It's actually the opposite of that.
So risk mitigation. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. I hadn't thought about it that way myself.
Yeah. Because the other scenario is that you stick to the product development plan that you made 6 months ago, and you deliver and launch, and then it's crickets.
Yeah.
Whereas if you this is why agile processes and all of that kind of stuff work really beautifully with human-centered design, because human-centered design feeds in that deep human insight that the agile process then enables the rapid test and delivery around, and then you can continually morph and iterate as you go.
Melissa, we've just about come to the end of our time, but there is one other thing I wanted to ask you, if I may, before we do. Sure. I want to talk a little bit about unintended consequences of innovation, and if you have come across anything and have any insights to share with us in that area.
Sure. I did I think that was it was my second South by Southwest presentation, actually, which was the dark side of design, where I spoke about the unintended consequences of design. And, there's part of those unintended consequences that we can have an influence around and we can mitigate. And that is done through systemic thinking and holistic thinking, and understanding that everything is connected and we're not just designing this one thing. It exists in the context of a journey. It exists in the context of a service ecosystem. It exists in the context of an organization. So by doing that work up front, you can, in a way, mitigate some of the unintended consequences. But also, I can use an example from my own life. There are some that you just can't foresee, and that just happens. And an example of that is when I was doing my PhD at the Defense Department, I needed to design some code to be able to do the experiments that I needed to do to be able to prove the question that I had. So again, I'm working in a science framework, and elements of that technology that I ended up developing for my research, which the whole point was about reducing workload in pilots. That was the point of this technology, was then picked up by a head-up display manufacturer and linked to weapon systems. So that's an unintended consequence of design, but also an example of, there are some things that are just outside of your sphere of influence and understanding at the time.
That is certainly a very unintended consequence of that situation, the complete opposite of what your intention was. Interesting. Melis, I thank you sincerely for joining us today. I really appreciate your time, and I know the audience will. And if anyone has any questions, I'm sure you can reach out and follow up with Melis, if that's okay, and myself. So Rafa, maybe if you could pop Melissa's email address and details there. But Melis, just before I thank the attendees for joining us as well, would you just finish up perhaps with just telling us a little bit about what you're doing today? So you started, your design journey. Where are you today? And I guess, what kind of services you can offer to us.
Sure. So in the time that I've been a practitioner of human-centered design, one of the challenges that I've seen is the transition that people needed to make from knowing a model of leadership that was conducive to organizational ways of working to a model of leadership that actually was more conducive to design. And so I spent the last, which includes my book, This Human, that I wrote in 2016. So since then, I've developed a program called Deep Leadership, which is about transitioning leadership models that we learn within an organization to leadership models that are more inherently human-centered and are inherently more adaptable, actually, that follow a design framework.
So adaptable, there's no better time than now to be an adaptive leader. Let's be honest about that. To the audience, so thank you so much for joining us today on behalf of myself and Melis. And I hope you've received lots of insights that can help you in your own journey as you go forward. And again, Melis, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Grania. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.
Bye.